Should you post your web stories on your social channels? Absolutely, and here's why and how. Okay, you might be legitimately confused by this. Maybe you're like, but Paul, wait, you want me to share a social thing on some other social thing? Am I not social enough already? And, well, I get where you're coming from, even though you're wrong. You're wrong because web stories are not social. By that, I don't mean they're introverts. They just aren't used for social content and not published to a social network. Web stories share the same tappable immersive format as their social counterparts, but that's about it. They live on your website or blog and are way more comparable to a blog post than to a social update, like some influencer in the wild you just discovered. Web stories are your core content. However, that doesn't mean they shouldn't make an appearance on your social network du jour. Having your story appear in Google is a good start, but web stories aren't just limited to these channels. They can also be shared to your social networks, the same way you would do it with a blog post. A strong social network sharing strategy can really amplify the discovery of your blog or website content and help build your audience. Chances are that when you create a blog post, you're already sharing it to a combination of social platforms like Twitter or Instagram. And it's really pretty much the same thing with web stories. You copy the link to a web story and you post it on your favorite social network. But let me share a few extra tips with you to really make sure your stories perform well and funnel readers back to your website. For Twitter, you should ensure that your story includes the Twitter card metadata. If you don't know what that is and are unsure whether your story has it already, you can always use the handy Twitter card validator to check. Put in the URL to your published story, and if everything checks out, it'll render a nice preview. Heads up that I sometimes have to click preview card twice to load the thumbnail for some reason. The great news is that a lot of visual editors are already adding this data for you. At the off chance the Twitter card data is missing, you can always learn how to add it in with a little bit of HTML knowledge and the Twitter card documentation. Okay, here's something important about Twitter though. Even if you know your story will technically preview fine on Twitter, it's still good to test it in the card validator because Twitter crops your poster image somewhere between 2:1 and 1:1 aspect ratio. So make sure it still looks okay and doesn't make you look unintentionally stupid. Over to Instagram. As you might already know, Instagram isn't exactly link friendly in most places, but there's one notable exception: the swipe up feature in their version of stories. This ability is only unlocked with a creator or business account with more than 10,000 followers or a verified badge. If that's you, then you can put a story into a story. We're experimenting with this neat pattern on our own Instagram account, meaning we're linking to a web story from an Instagram story, with the Instagram story usually serving as a cover page or poster. You might call me out now for being hypocritical after preaching that nobody should publish teaser stories, but I'd argue that a social network story where you post one page at a time anyway is very different from a web story scenario, where readers expect a multi-page editorial story with a beginning and end. I personally find the story in a story experience pretty smooth, but give it a try and decide for yourself. Next, Facebook and Pinterest both use a metadata standard called Open Graph. So if you're optimizing for one, then chances are you're doing pretty good on the other. Like before, it's fairly likely that if you're using a visual story creation tool, it will already generate the right metadata. For Facebook, you can easily check it with their own tool they're calling the Sharing Debugger. With Pinterest, it gets a little more interesting as there are a variety of different pin types available for you. For posting as a regular pin, you might want to make sure your story appears as a rich pin. A rich pin looks slightly more prominent with a bolder title and such, and you can check whether your story has the right metadata by running it through Pinterest's URL debugger. Of course, you could also experiment with capturing the first few pages of your story as a video and posting it as a video pin in a vertical or square aspect ratio. And if you want to go all out, you could try the story in a story thing again with Pinterest's flavor of stories, which they call story pins. Contrary to Instagram's version of stories, story pins are designed to be standalone stories with multiple pages with links on them. So unless you're building a listicle that legitimately links out to other web stories, I wouldn't recommend building teasers for your web stories on Pinterest for the same reason I complained about them in the previous episode about teasers. It's just not a great experience for the users that expect a full story on Pinterest, same as it isn't with web stories on Google Discover. As you can see, sharing is caring. And don't just share your beautiful web stories on social media, share them with us as well, like in the comments below on our Twitter or on Instagram. You find all the links in the description, and don't forget to subscribe for more web creator goodness. Onwards.